Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sire here today to discuss with you further on our topic of the civil rights. And this will be finishing our background lessons because we're now going to get into the 20th century and we have a quick go through the Reconstruction and Jim Crow eras. As always, important to remember this is a lesson catered towards the student level, so we're going to have some key content and knowledge throughout and focus on our historical skills as we go. If you've not already, do check out the previous two background lessons as they give you that bit of background detail we're going to need, not only for this video, but also for our series going forward once we get to the main part of the curriculum in the 20th century. So, all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So we finished the last lesson going over the American Civil War and how this conflict between the North and Southern states had really fractured America. But with the North's victory in 1865, they were now able to come to terms, create a peace, and try and integrate the South back into the North while ending the slave era. However, we should remember that one of the big problems with this victory was that the person who had orchestrated much of the political machinery and drive for ending slavery, being Abraham Lincoln, was now assassinated. They were now deceased, and they were not going to lead the nation going forward. Who was? Well, it was Andrew Johnson, and he's going to be a lot different to President Lincoln as we go forward. So, in 1865, Johnson takes over and he replaces the now deceased Lincoln because Johnson was vice president, so he naturally becomes leader after his death. So, in 1865, Johnson ensured the northern states had banned slavery across all of America, and he also amended the Constitution of America with some new amendments to change this. These were known as the Reconstruction Amendments. The first one was the 13th Amendment, and this made it constitutionally illegal for slavery to now actually exist, especially the way it did in that slavery era, where the blacks could simply be treated as property and owned by the whites. The slaves were now also given citizenship, so many of these African Americans under the new 14th Amendment can now be official American citizens and finally have a place in the American system. And the final one, the 15th Amendment, was to give them the right to vote. Now, this is very, very, very important. This is actually a major step in that progression of civil rights. The federal government has finally done not just one, not just two, but three major amendments to its constitution to make sure blacks can hopefully achieve that American dream that they not only deserve, but rightfully should have, as well as the whites. Now, this era is called Reconstruction because it really is the northern states trying to reconstruct the South after this quite vast and dangerous war. However, it faced a lot of resistance as time went on. It faced resistance from what's called the Ku Klux Klan. They were a group of individuals, mostly what's called WAS or white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, who believed in racial terrorism. This meant that they would go out and harass, even kill black people. And Johnson was, you would hope he would be a real opponent to the Ku Klux Klan. But a problem is that he was a Democrat. And now we're going to get more into the history of the Democrats and Republican parties when we get into our main curriculum video. But one thing to note is that at this time in the 1860s, the Democrats were predominantly Southern and therefore supported plantations, while yes, Johnson followed through on the Emancipation Proclamation, honored Lincoln's memory to make these new amendments. He did not go beyond that. He did not use much of his federal powers to really liberate and remove this oppression the Ku Klux Klan were doing in the South. And so it came down to the next leader, who was Republican President Ulysses S. Grant. Grant is really important because he was a veteran of the American Civil War. He made his name for himself. He won several battles. He was a bit of a drinker. He was a bit traumatized after all the losses that he saw, especially many of his young men who died for the cause. But he still believed in what they fought for, the Reconstruction and the emancipation of the African American communities. And so when he became president after Johnson, he went through what's called the Enforcement Acts. He used the Union Army in the North to go into the South and to attack and fight back against the Ku Klux Klan. For all intents and purposes, his intervention is what finally ended the Ku Klux Klan in its first mass demonstrations and finally put an end to them at this era. And they will sadly come back into being as time goes on, but it was a real big step to ensuring Reconstruction could work. However, we get into a big problem after 1877 when Ulysses S. Grant had moved on. And so we get into the Jim Crow era where the southern states begin to reassert themselves in new ways, to reassert not necessarily the slavery as it once was, but that Herrenvolk, that idea where the whites can still be above the blacks and equality is not fully maintained. How does this happen? Well, on one level, it comes down to the presidents. Several of them did very little after Ulysses S. Grant throughout the 80s and the 1890s. Many of them became focused on the mass industrialization, particularly the great move out west, and many of them really began to focus on big business, growing the American economy and becoming richer, focused on achieving their own American dream rather than serving the people and ensuring they could achieve the American dream. And so by 1900, we actually have a new state of America that comes to the fore. Politically, the southern states had technically followed the 13th Amendment, and slavery did not actually return to the United States, still in no way in that it once was. However, the South did what it could to get around those 14th and 15th Amendments, so the idea of citizenship and the right to vote. How were they going to do that? The southern states devised new ways to discriminate against black people. They introduced this idea of legal segregation. No longer illegal, but legally possible. This became known as the Jim Crow laws. Why is it called Jim Crow? We can see with the illustration on the right. It refers to this idea of jump Jim Crow. It was a song and dance caricature of black people that a white actor known as Thomas DeRice had performed while wearing blackface, all the way back in 1828. As a result of Rice's fame as this caricature, Jim Crow became a stereotypical image of how blacks not only behaved, not only looked, but what the position in America actually should be. All we have to do is take a look at the image. Again, the kind of like the jokey, playful dancing, ragged clothes, the toes and so forth, unclean, quite dirty, no soles on the shoes, his toes sticking out. This idea of a fool really. This image, as I say, that this generational racism that passes on throughout the decades becomes commonplace in many households, especially down south where this was really popular in the 1830s. And so the whites fought it on themselves to try and make sure that their belief system could not be fully removed and they could try and reinforce it in some way. And this culminates in the 1896 Supreme Court case known as Plessy v. Ferguson. This actually enforced these new Jim Crow laws that had come to being. The Jim Crow laws had made sure the South disenfranchised the black people and that therefore they could keep the segregationist politicians in power. As we said, the federal level took into account both northern and southern states. But in the southern states, they could also still have the governors, the ones who were separate from the federal law and therefore could run things in a bit more free and lax way. Again, this conflict between states' rights and federal rights have been what nearly tore America apart. And so there was a big push to let the South do its own thing. Not the way it once did, but certainly has still that flexibility, that states' right freedom that it craved. And so this Plessy v. Ferguson court ruling declared that segregation could be separate but equal. And the legal doctrine meant that facilities for African Americans could indeed be separate. And this included many of them. This meant your public facilities such as transportation could be separate. Blacks had to sit at the back of the bus rather than the front. They also had different restrooms. They had different schools. They had different facilities, different places of work. They could not integrate. They could not be together. The law was forcefully segregating them from one another. And these Jim Crow laws weren't just in one or two states in the South, they spread all over, and they were going to remain in place for decades to come. When blacks tried to challenge these, they faced more resistance. Quite sadly, Ulysses S. Grant, while he'd done a lot to remove most of the KKK, there still were KKK activities occurring, and they actually did sadly grow in strength. By 1900, the KKK successfully lynched 115 black people in that year alone. The Klan indeed was growing more powerful, and it was very difficult for senior politicians to try and remove them, especially when actually some of the politicians were either members of them or privately supporting their actions as well. And so, what is the situation by the time we get to the 1910s? Well, civil rights really has become a neglected issue in America. After that big promise of progress after the Civil War with the push for Reconstruction, it really has fell into mass stagnation, and some might even argue mass points of regression. We actually have the president at the time, President Woodrow Wilson. You may remember how I talked about how he's really supportive of the war effort and wanting to really get involved in the European conflict. He was more focused on foreign policy than actually solving problems with civil rights. It did not help that he also supported the film Birth of a Nation that came out and actually played it and revered it in the White House and the Oval Office itself. He, of course, did have history in the racial ways of the Confederate South. His father, of course, had served on the Confederacy years before. And so he indeed really allows segregation to carry on. It also did not help that many of the Protestant, white Anglo Saxon Protestant voters always voted for the Democrats because they had this history of racial support. They knew the Democrats because of Johnson after the American Civil War had been so lax, whereas Ulysses S. Grant had been so passionate to put a stop to it. But they could probably count on a Democrat president to let them have their own way in regards to segregation and their ideas of racial supremacy. There indeed was a true policy of laissez-faire, kind of leave it alone, that had infested in the American federal government in the past several decades. All we have to do is look at the images to see there's a clear inequality that's infested America, and despite everything that was fought for during the Civil War, it has sadly carried on and will carry on for decades to come. However, these facilities, they're clearly not equal, and the Jim Crow laws really were really reimposing a society that had existed in the slavery era. While in de jure, by law, this wasn't slavery, de facto, in reality, for many African Americans, it indeed was. These laws were going to remain in place for a really long time, and we're going to see if we get into the depth part of this series, we go through each of the presidents and the decades. And it really is a long walk to freedom that the African Americans have to endure. So, some closing questions now as we enter the main part of the series. We get into the main part of the 20th century we're going to be exploring. The first one we encountered was, who is the American dream really for? And despite what the Constitution has said, that everyone should have the right to life, liberty, and happiness, it really seems the system has designed itself over its decades to favor whites over the African Americans. Have the African Americans really achieved it by the 1900s? Well, in some ways they did. They did finally get those initial state rights laws. They initially got those amendments through, especially those Reconstruction amendments. But there's a clear stagnation by the early 1900s, and Jim Crow is, in all intents and purposes, reimposing that racism that had existed decades prior. So there's lots still to go, a lot of a long walk to achieve. And as we go forward, do keep track now of the civil rights we're going to encounter. We're going to see not just political change, but also social and economic factors that come into play. And so I do recommend you keep a track of those three factors and themes as we go through the series. How important is the role of federal government? Well, we should see so far, it has quite a bit of an impact, especially at this time when the African Americans don't really have much agency themselves. The government really is the one dictating that progress. They're the ones who are making the laws, they're the ones who use the enforcement acts to get involved, and they're also the ones who stand to the side and allow Jim Crow to take hold and fester in America and keep that deep seated racism alive, not just for a few years, but now over a century, it is still allowed to reign on. How will this change? Will there be progress throughout the 20th century? Well, do stick around in the series to find out. I hope you found this useful. I hope you found it insightful. Thank you as always for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson. This is History with Sire. Thank you for listening.